Welcome to the Healing Grove podcast. I'm Dr. Kristin, an integrative holistic family physician, author of Life After Lyme, and host in this virtual space of learning, healing, and growing. I believe humans are like trees, and our physical limb is only one of many. Health on all limbs of the tree, emotional, conceptual, social, spiritual, is absolutely required for the whole tree that is you to be vibrantly well. I created the Healing Grove podcast as a place to showcase some of the world's best integrative and holistic medicine, to expose you to transformative tools and mindset shifts for all limbs of your tree. I hope you enjoy our conversation in the Healing Grove today as much as I enjoyed having it. So everyone, this is Dr. Susan Peirce Thompson. She's an adjunct associate professor of brain and cognitive sciences at the University of Rochester. She's also a New York Times bestselling author and an expert in the psychology of eating. As president of the Institute of Sustainable Weight Loss and the CEO of Brightline Eating Solutions, she's dedicated to helping people achieve long-term sustainable weight loss. And she and her team are on a mission to help 1 million people get into their bright bodies by 2030. Wow, that's an awesome goal and intention. Her program utilizes cutting-edge research to explain how the brain blocks weight loss. And every day, she teaches people how to undo the damage that they've done in their brain so they can have peace and freedom around food. And I am super excited to hear what you're going to talk about today. I know it has something to do with food and something to do with addiction and something to do with the brain, three of my sort of favorite topics from different angles. But before we get into that, Susan, I would love for you to share with this community kind of what your journey has been like that brought you to this place where you're sharing this important information.
Oh, thanks, Kristin. It's so sweet to be with you. And hi, everyone out there. Hi. Yeah, my journey is just, really, it's one of addiction, a lot of addiction and a lot of seeking and searching. And I started life in San Francisco, California. My parents were hippies. And by the age of 14, I started doing drugs. And I was doing drugs experimentally, to party, to have fun, to meet boys, and also to curb my eating, to take off weight a little bit. I was already concerned about my weight, and the drugs I used escalated. And I found crystal meth or speed, which is it's just a scourge. It's a wicked thing, but it made me feel so good. And it really took away my appetite, which at the time felt like already, I think I was 16 at the time, already felt like such a mercy to just have the voracious appetite kind of removed. And I graduated from there to freebasing cocaine and smoking crack. And I dropped out of high school and prostituted to get more crack. And it just became a nightmare. And when I was 20 years old, I got struck clean and sober. I got taken to a 12-step meeting for drug and alcohol recovery. And I haven't had a drink or a drug since. So I've been clean now for 28 years.
Wow. Congratulations. I got to find my little congratulation emoji.
Thank you. And that is the biggest miracle of my life by far. That is the date, the date on which my whole life pivots, August 9th, 1994. Wow. But really, honestly, my struggles with addiction were not over because my addiction hopscotched right back to food. And I gained a ton of weight that fast. And that started me on a cycle of trying to figure out my food addiction. I was able to identify pretty quickly that I was addicted to food because I was using it the way I was using crack. I could see, and I know that sounds like such a strong statement, like how can you use food like you use crack cocaine? But I was staying up late and binging through, for hours, and I would get my paraphernalia, my bags and boxes and my concoctions and my foods, and I would go out, smoke a cigarette, come back in and eat more food. And it was like this hours upon hours thing that I was doing. And I was using food like I used to use drugs. And so by the age of 21, I knew I was a food addict. And recovery from food addiction is just, alas, much harder than recovery from drug addiction for so many reasons. I think the biggest one is that you have to keep eating. So you have to find a way to define your eating life so that you know what the first drink or drug is, where your food ends and the addictive food begins, so that you can draw that line. And so Bright Line Eating is the program. I mean, I'm getting ahead of myself now. I lost my excess weight when I was 28. I don't know, 8 years after I started looking for a solution to my food addiction. I did lose it in a 12-step food addiction program. And I tried many 12-step food programs, and there's lots of them, and some of them are very good. And a lot of it depends on the sponsor you have and so forth. In my professional life, after I got clean and sober, I went to college. I went to community college at first. Thank God for the community college system, because I was able to go from being a high school dropout to transferring to UC Berkeley, thanks to San Jose City College. And,
love California's public system and their whole community college system. It's a lot of my friends. I mean, I grew up in California too, and a lot of my people did that same thing, and siblings. It's a beautiful system.
The beautiful system, and I graduated from UC Berkeley with 4.0s and spoke at the graduation, and, went to get my PhD in brain and cognitive sciences, and dedicated myself to studying the mind and the brain. And in particular, I was always fascinated by how addiction works in the brain, and how a brain like mine could go so far off the rails. And so I ended up spending, almost 2 decades as a college psychology professor and teaching at colleges and universities around the world. And one of the courses I taught was the psychology of eating. And I ended up teaching a unit in that course on the neuroscience of food addiction. And so I started teaching about food addiction, and I had my own food addiction recovery, and I was teaching it at university. Mm-hmm. And I just got struck in my morning meditation one morning to write a book about it, about how the brain gets hijacked by these addictive foods in our food environment, and how that way of eating that's so addictive ends up convincing us that we don't love ourselves, that we don't value ourselves, even that we loathe ourselves, because we watch ourselves break our own most earnest promises to ourselves around food, where we intend to eat this, and then we feel like we're deciding in the clutch moment, no, I'll just eat this, and we indulge in this food, but we don't realize how our brain is hijacked. And that wasn't really a choice any more than when you're promising yourself you're going to hold your breath for 15 minutes, and at some point you choose to breathe. It's not really a choice, right? Your brain is demanding what it thinks it needs at that moment. And our food environment is hijacking our brain in that way. So anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself now, but I committed to write a book called Bright Line Eating, and that started the Bright Line Eating movement, because I started an email list to explain and disseminate information about the psychology and neuroscience of what it really takes to lose your excess weight and keep it off. I went from obese to slender when I was 28, and I'm 48 now. It's, almost 20 years now that I've been living in my right size body. And, I don't peddle thinness on push thinness on people. I really believe in body integrity and people having, that's why I don't even talk about thin anymore. I talk about a bright body, a body that feels in integrity for you, but I do know that a lot of the weight that a lot of folks are carrying doesn't feel right for them. It feels like a manifestation of a relationship with food that's not fully aligned. And that's the problem that I try to help people solve. So anyway, I come by this honestly, lots of pain, lots of years of experience, lots of tears, lots of writing letters to God in the fetal position, crying on the floor.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I've heard you talk about, maybe in one of your webinars, I've heard you talk about that kind of moment, like that epiphany. And I'm kind of a junkie for epiphany stories. So if you want to share that, I would be super psyched. But that, that transformation basically, where you sort of saw the light, saw that moment, right? That pivot was clear for you. So you can talk about that if you want. I'm inviting you to formally, but I also want to hear, about the addict brain, because I know there are some people on this call who are like, well, I'm not sure if I'm the kind of person who has this relationship to food that's a problem, or I'm wondering how I would know if it were a problem. Like, do you have a way to help people kind of sort themselves in terms of, should I be thinking of myself as a person who might need bright light eating or not?
Yeah, totally. Happy to talk about epiphany moments. I've had so many of them that you'll have to be more specific because, oh my gosh, I've had a lot of, I meditate for 30 minutes every morning, and I don't get, white lights every morning, but I do often have experiences. So we can go there if you want to, just be more specific for me, so I know which, which epiphany moment to share. And then, I already shared one, maybe, which was, my inner voice, God, self, universe, whatever it was, said, write a book called Bright Line Eating. And I pulsed with the need in our world for real information about how the brain works with food and how to break free if you're trapped in an addictive relationship with food. So that was a big epiphany.
That was a big one. Was that the first one, or were you already a meditator then and already kind of used to this experience of like connecting to your higher self or God or whatever you want to call it? Like, was that new?
I'd been meditating every morning for 30 minutes for about 10 years at that point. Okay. Is that right? Yeah, 11 years. And the moment before that that stands out is when I was in the crack house, and I had a moment of clarity where I knew that if I didn't get up and get out of that crack house right that second, that's all I was ever going to be. I was a prostitute. I had a blonde wig on my head, and I'd been smoking crack in that hotel room for like 3 or 4 days straight. And suddenly I was awake and aware and present. And I thought of my childhood self that wanted to go to Harvard. And I was 20. I was a high school dropout. I hadn't been in school for years. And that's the other one that stands out, that moment where I just knew I could feel my future. And it was like, this moment, if you don't get up and get out of here, you will just be on an endless path of drug use, prostitution, and quitting and restarting and quitting and restarting and quitting and restarting.
Wow. So I think I speak for everyone in the audience when I say I'm so grateful that you had the ability to listen at that moment and make that choice, because you're here to change the world, and that would have been a dead end. Yeah.
Very dead end. Yeah.
So, totally acknowledge you for that. So tell us about the addiction piece, because it's so huge. And I love that you've brought the addiction model to bear on our relationships to food, because many people don't see what you saw so clearly, having been an addict and then becoming a food addict.
Yeah. And I think for some people it's really obvious, and for even for people for whom it's obvious, it's often not so obvious. So what I want to say about food addiction is, I don't think it's a binary. I don't think you're either a food addict or not a food addict. I think it's a continuum. And this is why in the instrument that I developed called the susceptibility scale to measure food addiction, it's not a binary. It doesn't just say, bing, yep, you're a food addict. Nope, you're not a food addict. It gives you a score from 1 to 10, where you can say, okay, so 6, right? On a scale from 1 to 10, are you a food addict? Well, you're a 6. So does that mean you're a food addict? It means you got enough addiction on board that it might be problematic if you try to take off excess weight. It might be that you find yourself sometimes overeating, where you intend to have a moderate amount of food, but you find yourself overeating in a way that feels like you've lost control a bit over how much you eat. But it might mean that you don't, binge your brains out on a regular basis. And it might mean that if you keep certain foods out of the house, that's enough, because you won't go out of your way to get them, right? At a clutch moment, if you're about to watch Netflix and the box of chocolates isn't in the house, you won't sit down. But if it's in the house, you'll grab it and then you'll eat more than you intended. So the strategy is, don't keep the box of chocolates in the house, right? Whereas for someone like me, who's a 10 on the scale, that doesn't do it, because I'll go to the store to get the box of chocolates, and I don't even care if it's a snowstorm out, right? If I'm about to cozy up with Netflix for the evening, I'll make sure I got what I need, and a run to the store is not at all beyond what I'm willing to do. So, it's a gradation, right? And some of the things that are in play, are, do you lose control over how much you eat once you start? Do you find yourself not feeling satisfied by, a regular ample amount of food? Do you still not feel satisfied? Do you find yourself thinking too much about what you've eaten or not eaten, whether you're on your plan or off your plan, how many miles, how many calories, how many pounds, is the food and weight rigmarole taking up more room of your headspace than feels warranted, right? For a balanced life. Like, why am I thinking about this so much? Do you have cravings? How powerful are they? Do they drive you out of your way? I mean, and this is where like, oh my gosh, I had to give up decaf coffee recently. I'm certifiable, just God bless me, I'm ridiculous, but I'd given up caffeine already, but decaf, I was like making my life unmanageable, you know, needing to swing by Starbucks for a decaf grande Americano. I don't put anything in it, black, but there's a little bit of caffeine in that decaf, and more so at Starbucks. I think they know us addicts, that they have a little bit of,
Yeah.
you know, and it was like, I felt enslaved a bit. So I recently gave up decaf, right? But so the issue of cravings, is it making you go out of your way? Is it pulling on your mental headspace, you know, where you're thinking about a certain food or what have you? Yeah. Do you binge? You know, have you tried to quit or change your eating over and over again with no lasting success? Those are some of the questions that can help you identify. If you really just want to get down and dirty and get a number on it, then take the quiz and go to foodaddictionquiz.com and take the quiz, and you'll get a number from 1 to 10. And, you know, anything 7 or above is like, it's pretty high. And it means that you're going to want, what that really means is you're going to probably benefit from more structure and discipline around your eating than you've ever thought. That really some clarity around when to eat, how much to eat is going to be freeing for you, not confining. Someone who's a 1 or a 2 or a 3 on the scale, they don't need structure around how much or when to eat, because their body just tells them, and an intuitive eating approach works really well for them. You get into the range of 7, 8, 9, 10, and intuitive eating just doesn't work. I mean, that's the hallmark of addiction, right? Is that the urges, the intuitions of the brain have stopped being productive, healthy, and helpful. They've started being excessive and unhelpful. And you can't actually tune in to like, do I feel like a drink right now? Do I feel like a cigarette right now? It's like, well, of course you feel like a cigarette. You just quit smoking. You should not have a cigarette, right? So anyway.
Like our signals become sort of untrustworthy.
Yeah. And I hate to say that because it's such a nice construct to think that all of the signals coming from our body are always helpful all the time. But alas, it's just not true for some of us. It just isn't.
Does that change after you're, sober from the foods that create those problems, or the substances that create those problems? Or is that always the case, do you find?
Oh my gosh. Yes and no. So what happens is the way the brain works is it wires up these fiber tracts in the brain. And when you really change, so let's take me, right? I used to be a drug addict. I used to use drugs, and I changed. I got clean and sober. I stopped using drugs. Over those years of using drugs, I wired up fiber tracts in the brain for the cues and the behaviors in response to those cues that led to my drug addiction. And when I stopped using drugs, I took all that neural energy and I diverted it into new pathways of going to meetings and, a whole new life.
Mm-hmm.
Do the signals become reliable? Well, to a point in your new life, yes, you'll have new fiber tracts and new ways of operating in the world, new behaviors that you engage in response to a certain cue. You'll do a different action and not the addictive using action. But what happens is if you go back to the behaviors or substances that used to be problematic, it's like a dry riverbed. Once you start putting water into the dry riverbed, it's very quickly a river again, So unfortunately, once you go back to the old patterns of action, the old fiber tracts are still there, and they very quickly take up that neural energy, and you're right back where you started. So as long as you stay vigilant with your new patterns of behavior and your new program of abstinence, whatever it is, then yes, you have a new, recovery is very real, and you can, within that new context, trust the signals coming from your body to a significant degree, but not if you're going back to the old foods and eating behaviors that used to cause difficulty. Then you'll quickly find that that you're right back where you started.
This makes so much sense to me from my own experience with gluten, actually. So when I took the food freedom quiz the first time a few years ago, I was like, I took it for two people. I took it for the person I used to be when I was a college athlete and eating all these carbs and everything I want, lots of bread, lots of everything. And I took it for myself currently, which is gluten-free, since I had Lyme disease, I've been gluten-free. And I was two completely different numbers.
Yeah.
And I know that when I eat that again, it's like everything rears up and it's like, oh, we can do that. We can do that. And I just am like, yeah, we can do that. We can do that. You know, so that for me has become maybe a bright line, right? Because I know what happens to me if I eat the foods that used to kind of create those cravings.
That's it. Exactly. Yeah. And so the quiz that I directed people to at foodaddictionquiz.com or foodfreedomquiz.com,
yeah.
It asks you to consider your eating when it was at its worst. So that would be you back when you were eating gluten and a college athlete. And that's not because that's going to be your experience forever and ever, but what it does mean is whatever that higher number was, you're always going to have to be vigilant like someone who has that higher number, right? It's not that you're resigned to having that experience with food, however, forever. I have the brain of a 10 on the susceptibility scale, but I live my life like a 2 or a 3. I have like none of those issues anymore, really. I don't have cravings. I feel satisfied after I eat my meals. I'm not thinking about food one way or the other. I mean, really on my best days, sometimes I'm a 1 on the scale, but I have to be vigilant. It's almost like, it's like a borrowed tiara, right? It's not my tiara to wear to the ball. It's a borrowed tiara, but it's on lease and I get to wear it forever as long as I, whatever. I don't know if that's a good analogy. But
no, I can visualize it. So that's the super hopeful message. And I can imagine a lot of people listening to this who have already self-identified as like, oh yeah, I'm a 7, I'm an 8, I'm a 12, are hopefully heard that piece about like, you feel like a 1 some days, you live your life as a 2, like that's pretty powerful. And so now they want to know like, well, what is she doing? Like, what's her secret? So are you willing to share some of your secret with us?
Yeah, totally. So, the program that I started is called Bright Line Eating, and there's 4 bright lines: sugar, flour, meals, and quantities. So the flour line isn't gluten, it's flour, but it's not impossible, but it's pretty hard to eat gluten if you're not eating any flour, because all wheat flour and stuff is out. Sugar is all sugar, and it's also no sweeteners, so it's no honey, no agave. The sweeteners have the sweet taste buds on the tongue have a direct connection to the addiction centers in the brain. And sugar and flour, not perfectly, but almost perfectly. If you're not eating sugar and flour, you're eliminating the addictive foods essentially. And the hyper palatable foods, the ultra processed foods, the foods that are really toxic. So in Bright Line Eating, we eat only whole real foods. We don't have any bars or pills or shakes to sell you. We're just going to tell you to go to the grocery store and buy actual food. Yeah. And then the bright lines for meals and quantities really take care of the process addiction to eating itself. So food addiction is an interesting thing. It's both a substance and a process addiction. The substance of the processed foods, and then the process of eating itself. And so having boundaries around when we eat. So the initial recommendation is eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, 3 meals a day. Don't snack, don't graze, 3 meals a day. And then I encourage people to get a digital food scale and weigh their food, which sounds so crazy, I know, but it's actually, believe it or not, to make sure that you eat enough. There's a lot of food on the Bright Line Eating food plan, and you won't eat enough. Otherwise, especially if you're trying to lose weight, you'll think that you need to eat less than you really do. And the Bright Line Eating plan is amazing for weight loss. As a matter of fact, research shows people lose and keep off 4 times more weight, 4 times, not 4%, 4 times more weight than on Noom, Weight Watchers, Jenny Craig, Nutrisystem, Biggest Loser, eDiets, any other program with published data in the scientific medical literature. seriously, pretty powerful. So yeah, so there's a whole program, there's a whole community of us. It's the Bright Line Eating community, the Bright Line Eating membership. It's a monthly membership, and I've got a curriculum. I'm a college professor at heart, so there's a Bright roadmap that's about a 2-year curriculum that it takes people through to completely transform your life and give you a full Bright transformation. And that's body, mind, heart, soul. Of course, people often come in for weight loss, which is fine. And we will give you guidance on how to find your Bright body and know when to stop losing weight. And, but really it's about so much more than that. It's a full identity shift. It's a full lifestyle. And, yeah, that's the gig. That's it.
Well, and I want you to say a little bit more about the conceptual piece and the emotional piece, because I know that your program does that. I watched a webinar a couple of years ago where you had an expert in internal family systems. Are you still using that? And that was so exciting to see, because, you know, it's not just about your physical body and like your habits, right? You have to transform kind of all limbs of your tree to get the kind of transformations that you're talking about.
That's right. And so, yeah, for anyone out there who doesn't know internal family systems, the idea here, like, why would we use internal family systems? Well, we are eating over stuff, right? We're eating because our brains are hijacked, and we're eating because we have an addictive relationship with food, or maybe we don't have an addictive relationship with food. Maybe we just are eating over emotions and over stress. That's possible too. And that's actually separate from addiction. You don't have to have addiction in play to be eating over emotions and stress. But internal family systems is a branch of psychology that provides, I think, the most helpful and meaningful framework for a human being that it's possible to learn. So I think this is so helpful that I'm just going to share it, if I may, because I
think people, if you don't know about it, you should know about it. So I'm glad you're going to share. Yeah,
exactly. Okay. So the idea is that, and I just got to give a nod to the person who created it. So his name is Richard Schwartz, and he's a professor. And in the 1980s, he was a professor of family systems therapy. So this is different. Family systems therapy. It's the one that says there's an oldest child, a middle child, and a youngest child, and that each person is shaped by the family dynamics in their family. So maybe they're the scapegoat of the family, or maybe they're the savior of the family, or whatever. Anyway, he was treating bulimics, funny enough. And he ran this clinical trial and discovered that his family systems therapy was not working at all. Like it was having zero impact on the binge episodes of these patients with bulimia. And so we started interviewing them to find out how this could be. He really thought he was doing great therapy. So he was like, how is this not working? And so he interviews them, and what he hears them say is things like, well, why did I binge? I don't know. There was this part of me that just wanted to binge. And then there was this other part of me that thought, no, we've been doing so well. We've got to keep our weight off, and this part would argue with this part. And he realized, oh my goodness, my patients have a family system inside of themselves. They've got like a family dynamic going on, and they're arguing with themselves. And that's where the term internal family systems comes from. So internal family systems. So it's abbreviated IFS. And over many more years of development, what Dick Schwartz came to was that each person has a true core, authentic, highest self. And that we know that we're approaching life from our highest self when we're in the 8 C's, these words that start with C. So when we're calm, clear, compassionate, courageous, connected, confident, curious, when we're in those, when we're operating from that place, that calm, clear, connected, creative place, then we're in our authentic self. If we're anything else, if we're angry, if we're racy, if we're scared, if we're anything else, then we're in a part. We're operating from not our whole authentic self, but a part of us. And now it gets really interesting, because the landscape of parts actually breaks down in a way that makes so much sense. He said, look, there's 2 kinds of parts. There's wounded parts, and we all can relate to these. These are like the inner child, the wounded inner child, right? And he calls them exiles because they're often tucked away, like exiled from view, from sight. And so there's these wounded parts, and then there's protector parts. There's parts of us that are trying to protect us from being wounded. Makes sense, right? And so this is like anger would be a protective part. It's actually protecting a wound. Now, he said the protective parts can either come in advance, like protecting us before wounding might happen. These are often controlling or managing parts, right? They want to arrange the world so that we don't get hurt. So they can be controlling. They could also be caretaking. They could be going in to be extra nice and kind and so that everybody likes us, right? So those are all manager parts. And then there's protector parts that come in after we're already hurt. So that would be like anger, right? Comes in after we're already hurt. But all the addictive parts also come in after we're already hurt. The binging part, the overeating part, the watching pornography part, the smoking cigarettes part. You know, there's so many ways, you know, the hiding under the covers part, the watching Netflix part, right? These are all the ways that we can. So what's helpful about this, I think there's so many things that are helpful about it, but one is to learn to talk about ourselves as parts. Because without that, if you think of yourself as one unified self, then it just feels like you're kind of at odds with yourself all the time, or maybe even crazy, right? Because why, if you really want this, why would you do that? Right? And it's like, oh, well, it's a part of you that wants this, and then it's a different part of you that's doing that. And when you separate out the parts, it actually makes perfect sense. And just for those who, because as a psychologist, I'm just aware this sounds maybe frighteningly close to dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. And let me just say, it's not that at all. The idea here is that every healthy personality has parts, and that you couldn't have it any other way. And just so you know, the luminaries throughout time that came to this conclusion are many, including, shall we just say, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, Freud, Nietzsche, the Bible. I could go, you know, Jung, I could go on, but, you know, Socrates maybe said it best. He said, one unified mind cannot both want and not want at the same time. Therefore, we're all at least two, right? And anyone who's ever sat there and wanted a cookie and not wanted a cookie at the same time can attest to the fact that there's two parts, right? There's the part that wants it and the part that doesn't. So we teach people in Bright Line Eating how to know their parts. And with a food journey, this is so apropos, because we often have a rebel part that rebels against any structure with our food that says, I don't need that. I can just do it myself. We have an isolator part that keeps us back from community or connection that would actually be helpful on our journey. We've got a food indulger part that really wants to just indulge in food. And we've got a food controller part that wants to manage our food and get it lined up and buttoned up already and help us lose weight and help us get healthy already with our food. And so understanding these different parts really helps us on our journey, just to name it, to sort it out, and then to work with it and to heal ultimately, because in IFS, you really learn to heal the wounded parts, which is where the deepest change comes from.
I love that. I'm so grateful for that overview, because I think it was really clear and helpful. And I think it's a huge piece of any kind of change that people are making, is to sort of start to recognize the various facets of themselves that have different stakes in the game, you know, and to honor everybody's stake. You know, you can't just, like, if you've got some people in there who are like really committed to getting their way, like, you're not going to just be able to do something different without really having that internal conversation in some way.
Exactly. And give them a voice. They just want to be heard. They just want to be heard. They come by their perspective really honestly, and agreed, when they're digging in, the behavior is going to keep coming out sideways. And often all it takes is a deep breath and a curiosity. Curiosity is one of the 8 C's, right? When you're curious, you can go inside with some compassion and curiosity and say, hey, you know, I noticed that you keep, you know, driving me to the convenience store for that pint of ice cream. But here we are dealing with lupus and it's not helping, you know, and, you know, hey, so can we talk about this? And then the part says, yeah, but, you know, I'm so afraid that blah, 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 blah. And it just like, it unloads all its concerns. And you could say, oh, I so get that, sweetheart. I so get why you would feel that way. And can you see that this is actually making me sick? You're trying to help me. You're trying to ease this concern here, but the pint of ice cream is actually hurting me. Can we work on a different, what if we, when that scary thing comes up, what if I worked with you to hold your hand and we could address it this different way? And sometimes with just a 10-minute internal dialogue like that, you can clear up, the most, long-standing difficult behavior patterns.
Yeah. Well, there's something so powerful really about bringing awareness to something and giving a voice to something and just shining the light, put the light on it and say, okay, here we are. Is this who we really want to be? Is this who we still need to be now that you've been seen? Little part of me that wants this.
Yeah.
So beautiful. So there's a couple questions in the chat I want to get to, but I have one big question for you. And that is there anyone who, let's say that there's a person who self-identifies as having, being a 7 to 10, and they say, wow, bright line eating is for me. It could be for me. It could be helpful. Is there anyone who shouldn't use bright light eating? I'm thinking in particular of people who, are bulimics or are anorexic or have disordered eating already. And that's an addiction of its own, right? Like that becomes its own kind of triggerable event. And I'm worried about people potentially getting triggered by the rigidity, the necessary rigidity.
Yeah.
Bright line eating. So talk to that if you would.
Yeah, sure. Eating disorders are a special case, and some people have an eating disorder without food addiction, and some people have an eating disorder with food addiction. Ashley Gearhart of the University of Michigan has done some really interesting research on this. Of active bulimics, it might be close to 100% in the active state who have food addiction. But of people with a restricting disorder like anorexia, it's often a much lower percentage, but not zero. Of people with an eating disorder overall, it's about 50% who have food addiction. And I don't think it's true that an eating disorder is food addiction or is an addictive disorder necessarily. And so what I would say is, first of all, we have professional support in Bright Line Eating on a group level for people who are concerned about eating disorder issues. We do not have one-on-one therapy for someone with an active eating disorder. So if someone has an active eating disorder, we would hope that they have professional treatment. And unfortunately, it's hard to come by someone who is a eating disorders professional who's open to an abstinence-based approach like Bright Line Eating, because the way eating disorder treatment, the way those people are educated is that all food rules are bad. And the first thing you've got to do with someone with bulimia or anorexia or binge eating disorder is disabuse them of their food rules. Food rules like I don't eat sugar. The challenge is that for the 50% who have food addiction, they are likely never going to recover with a non-abstinence-based approach. So there are a lot of people actually with an eating disorder who should do Bright Line Eating. And we have Dr. Joy Jacobs on staff who provides support there and can potentially help you to find maybe a professional therapist or someone to work with you who does support your treatment for food addiction as well. The numbers are increasing of people who treat people with eating disorders and who have noticed basically, geez, my patients, when they're told to eat, a cookie, a cupcake, they always go off the rails. And there are subsets of people in that population who just maybe should never be eating those foods. It's just not productive. We do find that for some small but consistent percentage of people who have strains of an eating disorder background or maybe an eating disorder from the past that they've recovered from, that Bright Line Eating re-triggers that eating disorder because of the structure of it, the rigidity of it, as you mentioned. And rigidity is an interesting word, structure, discipline, rigidity. Okay. That's fine, whatever. And what I would say is with an IFS approach, like if you start to understand the food controller part, the part that might get excited of like, let's say someone had binge eating disorder or anorexia or whatever in the past, or bulimia in the past, and has recovered, but now is carrying 20 pounds that they wish they weren't carrying, or some number of pounds, whatever, and is noticing also that they're eating, that there's something off with their eating, that they're not loving. They could start doing Bright Line Eating. And what I would say is just be really mindful of the part of you that might go, oh, we get to restrict our food now. Oh, now, oh, how thin can we get, right? And so what I would say is, if you're willing to shine the light on it and you're willing to get support from Dr. Joy and from the community that we have that's separate for people with an eating disorder background, bright line eating can absolutely be a path to that next level of health and wellness. But be mindful of it. And it might be that bright line eating isn't for you. Bright line eating is not for everybody. So I would say either could be true. It's a nuanced answer for sure.
Yeah. But I love that there's support in there for the people who are challenged by it or need extra help or even just kind of direction and resources. Right. So there's a couple questions in the chat. Would you be open to answering some of these?
Of course.
Okay, first one from John. I have an 80-year-old friend on 10 or more medications with various forms of cancer, 50 pounds overweight, and in total denial. Not sure which party's in denial, but there's a lot of things in that sentence, John. How can I help him go to your program? I understand people will die for their beliefs, as limited as they may be.
Oh, John. I often say bright line eating, unfortunately, isn't for people who want it. It's for people who need it. And it's really your friend's call whether they need it. Sorry, did I just say that backwards? It's not for people who need it. It's for people who want it. I think I said that backwards.
Scratch that, reverse. Yep, got it.
Yeah, scratch and reverse. It's for people who want it and are willing to work it, right? And so, John, other than just, so I think there's probably nothing you can do, is my honest answer. But if you wanted to try something, I would say get my book, Bright Line Eating, the first one, Bright Line Eating, The Science of Living Happy, Thin, and Free. Get that first book, read it, flag a page that has some sort of interesting thing on it that you think your friend might like. Give them the book and say, hey, I just read this book. I loved it. And I thought of you on page 42 because of this cool story that I thought you would like. Leave them the book. And then really the rest is in their hands. It's on Audible too. And the membership is at brightlineeating.com, but they have to want it, John. There's nothing you can do to make them want it. I know really, if you think about it, there's 2 billion people right now who are overweight or obese and food addicted in this world. And, most of them are not going to be doing bright line eating anytime soon. It's a sad state of affairs, but there's really nothing we can do, fundamentally. I'm so sorry about that.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. From Kim, I'm on my 12th day being sugar and gluten-free. Good job, Kim. Woo! I'm wondering if insomnia can be part of a detox. I'm doing okay with not giving into cravings, but the lack of sleep is difficult. Would you speak to the idea of detox, and does that happen with your BL years? And what do you think?
Detox is very real. Sugar and flour are real drugs. And yes, insomnia can be part of it in a couple ways. One is that an abrupt detox like that, even if it's not abrupt, it can be perceived by the system as a stressful event. And so stress hormones can come in and keep you awake. Also, flour especially is quite a sedative. And so if you were used to eating, if you just think about what you used to eat late at night, odds are that you used to kind of sedate yourself to sleep, and you're not having the benefit of that anymore. It does typically pass. And so hang in there.
Thank you. All right. Tammy just wants to give you a shout out. She says, I've lost 134 pounds on Bright Line Eating. And thank you, Susan, for this amazing program.
Oh, hey, Tammy. Amazing.
I bet you get a lot of those love letters every day. Yeah,
I do, but they never get old. They never get old. It's amazing. Yeah.
So cool. Amy asked about OCD. And the question is, do you believe that addiction is a form of OCD, or maybe the inverse, OCD is a kind of addiction? I'm not sure how to phrase that question, but what's the relationship between OCD and addiction?
My understanding of OCD is it's a pattern of thinking, right, of intrusive, unwanted thoughts where doing some sort of compulsive behavior temporarily alleviates the thought, but then you're in a rut and you need to kind of keep doing these behaviors. For example, I have a friend who has OCD, and she didn't learn to drive until her late 30s because every time she got behind the wheel of a car, she would, her brain would tell her, you got to check the rear view mirror 14 times or you're going to crash. Check, check, check. And she wasn't a safe driver because she kept doing these behaviors. It could be that that's a subset of addiction. I tend to think of them as separate myself. But I'm not sure I'm right about that. I know that OCD used to be thought of as an anxiety disorder, and then they moved it out of the anxiety classification and so forth. I don't know.
Yeah, I can throw in on this one because I see a lot of OCD in my patients with Lyme disease. And a lot of times when the Lyme gets treated, the OCD goes away. So I'll just put that out there. It sometimes can be a toxic insult to the brain that's perpetuating inflammation. A lot of kids with pandas, which is sort of the autoimmune brain response to having some kind of toxin or infection that's sort of stimulating the autoimmune reaction, that can lead to OCD as well. And that can sometimes go away with proper treatment. So I'll just put that out there as a public service announcement for people. All right. Lori says, how can you best bring yourself back after gearing away from your bright lines?
I think support, really, really look at your support structure. So first and foremost, are you really doing it, right? Are you in the membership? Are you in the community? Do you have a mastermind group? Do you have a buddy? Join the next round of the Gideon Games. Like, really look and make sure that your support is shored up. I know a lot of people think of themselves as doing bright line eating, but when I really get in there, it's like they're not connected up, right? It takes the community really to form an identity that's solid enough to withstand the daily onslaught of living in this society that does food the way it does and is constantly eroding, your conception of what we do here in bright line eating. So that's the first thing. And usually that's enough. Once your support is in place, then it just gets back to the fundamentals of write your food down at night. And then the next day, eat only and exactly that. Do you have the bright line eating food journal? Just even that tool is so sweet, just to be able to write your food down the night before and, give yourself the gold star at the end of the day. And it's really a very simple program based on fundamentals. But if you don't have the support in place, it's going to erode.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it really gets to this idea that healing happens best in community, always.
Yeah.
Like whatever the problem, the answer is community and, accountability. Yeah. Beautiful. From Mara, I've been on Bright Line Eating for 23 months and I've lost 155 pounds, Mara. Nice job. It's the only program that has ever worked in my lifelong journey. Have you ever considered tracking how many people have lost over 150? I believe those numbers are very high now. Thanks, Susan Peirce Thompson.
Yeah, so we need to create the Bright Transformation database because we want 1 million Bright Transformations by 2030. And I think I had shortened that to 2025 recently, but I think it needs to be 2030. Anyway, and we need the database to track that. And we would ask for, starting and ending numbers, and we would be able to pull that information. So yes, we need that. And what I want to do is I want to write, I haven't decided yet if a book but definitely a journal article, maybe called something like the Bright 100, and to look at people who went from class 3 obesity to a normal BMI and are maintaining it for years, because the medical community really thinks that that's not really possible non-surgically, And we have so many people in Bright Line Eating who've done that. So I want to really look at people who've done that. It's possible, and it's remarkable. So
yeah. Well, that's just one of a number of things that I can think of off the top of my head that the medical community doesn't get. And on behalf of the medical community, I just want to say I'm sorry for our continuous misinformation with authority that we promulgate in so many ways, including this one.
Well, I can't even say apology accepted because there's a rebel part of me that wants to say, well, stop it then,
Yeah, no. And I live that rebel moment too. Mara says, yes, a book, the Bright 100. Yes. So you've got your first follower there. Benny says, I believe this is the most powerful and revolutionary program created, and I'm so grateful for all you do. I did Bright Line Eating for the first time last year, lost 60 pounds in 5 months. Whoop, whoop, Benny. I fell off the path due to high stress from traveling and autoimmune health issues, chronic Lyme and mast cell activation system, to name a few. My food choices are incredibly narrow due to tons of sensitivities, which is very triggering. What do you suggest to not feel too deprived on BLE?
Oh my gosh, Benny. Here's the truth, Benny. I eat almost the same thing every day. And I suggest you work with the part of you that feels deprived, because that part needs a lot of love, that part that feels like there needs to be more variety. But if you talk with that part and find other ways to get variety, it could be, I'm just imagining the other ways that you could get variety, right? But there are ways to introduce spontaneity variety, color, into your life.
Spice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, the reality is that sometimes life is hard and sometimes we have to accept things that aren't ideal, they aren't the way we would wish, but there's also sometimes a blessing in that. And, it seems like this is an opportunity to surrender to, eating a very few food choices and just making them your routine and finding a different way to work with the part of yourself that feels really frustrated and sad and however it feels about that, and to find other ways to find the happiness that that part is seeking.
Yeah. It reminds me of when I sort of was in my near-death experience with Lyme disease, and I ultimately had to decide to make a lot of the same choices that Benny are talking about making. I didn't drink alcohol. I didn't eat gluten. I went off all the allergens, and for me, I never, ever could have made that decision without the a priori commitment to, I think I'm still wanting to be alive. Like, I think I actually want to still live, because if I wanted to live but not make those choices, it wouldn't have been living, right? It would have been misery and even potential death. Like, it was that bad. And I think that that's a really tough question, but I think it needs to be asked. And this gets to the earlier questions and the struggle that's happening in the Q&A about, like, well, what about these people who won't change? And what about, like, some people are never going to change. Some people will never decide to change. And that's their journey, right? That is their journey. We have to let go of the need to heal everybody, help everybody, and focus on the one person we can help.
Yeah. My aunt died last month.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. And she died of food addiction, and she died absolutely having another way, right? Like knowing bright line eating. As a matter of fact, she did bright line eating 7 years ago, for vanity, for her daughter was getting remarried, and she did it for a couple months, and her dementia lifted, and she lost 30 pounds in 2 months, and she felt great, looked great. And then she had some cake at the wedding and never got it back, and never even tried to get it back. And her 3 daughters, my cousins, begged her, pleaded with her as her dementia got worse and her diabetes got worse. And I flew out to California, and I was by her bedside for the last 10 days of her life. And her throat had closed up. Her diabetes was so bad at the end of her life that after 11 days of fasting, her blood sugar was 351.
Wow.
Yeah, after 11 days of no food. And then she died. And the reality was, her daughters saw it as the biggest betrayal, really, like FU almost, because they all have little kids, and that really, if she'd have changed her eating, she would have lived 10 years longer, probably, who knows. But she was 73. She didn't need to die at 73. And she just, it's a mystery why some people can't or won't change, and addiction is, it's a beast. It's really, really a strong disease. And I don't begrudge anyone. I don't begrudge my aunt, and I don't begrudge anyone who decides that they want to eat their pizza and their ice cream. I feel like in this society, it is hard to swim upstream and do something different with your food. And it does take a big commitment, and it's a whole new identity and a different way to live. And it's a no-brainer for me. I'm so happy living this life, but not everybody wants it, and not everybody can see it or will do it. Anyway.
Yeah. And we all can be lovable on our own path, right? We don't have to be on the same path to be worthy of love and acceptance.
Absolutely. Well said.
Good news. So in the last few minutes here, is there anything else you feel like this audience could benefit from hearing from you? Any last thoughts, any steps they could take besides the food freedom quiz if they wanted to work with you or learn more about this pathway?
Yeah, I would say, well, first of all, Kristin, I just have so enjoyed my time with you. I think you're great. This has been
I feel the same.
Yay. And thank you for the work you're doing with your community. I'm so grateful that there's doctors like you who are working closely with people who need really extra support. And, my imagination, Kristin, is that the people in your community really, with the medical issues they have, really, really need to eat a certain way. And I don't mean the bright line eating way. I mean, like, nutrition is going to be a really big part of the prescription, for turning it around. And for a significant percentage of people, adhering to a protocol like that is going to be hard if there's addiction in play. And so bright line eating can really, really help with that. It can really help with that. Even for me, I didn't used to be able to take medicine, like supplements or whatever, regularly, because I was just so higgledy-piggledy and loosey-goosey with my life because my eating wasn't regular anyway. So for anyone out there who feels like they want to give bright line eating a try, I would say just go start the free trial. You can start it for free today. You just go to brightlineeating.com. It's just BRIGHTLINE, brightlineeating.com. We'd love to see you in there. Give it a try. Start the planning and preparation process. And we have a bright roadmap with, really clear steps along the way. It's like a 2-year curriculum that will totally transform your life. And you've heard already from people in the chat, it really, really does work. It really does. And it's worth it. You're worth it.
Well, that's a beautiful place to end. Thank you again for being here. Thank you for all that you're doing in the world. Thank you for the love and care that you give your members and you've given our audience today. I just really appreciate you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Kristin. Thanks for the invitation to be here with your community. I'm so grateful.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Healing Grove podcast. If you liked it, please be sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to deepen your experience further, consider grabbing a copy of the Healing Grove Playbook. With journal prompts for this podcast and 41 others, it's the perfect place to record your learnings, keep track of the tools you explore, and reflect on your own experience. Finally, it's important to mention that even though I am a doctor, nothing you hear on this podcast, whether from myself or my guests, constitutes medical advice. Any intervention you try should always be discussed with and supervised by a trusted member of your own healing team. Thanks for listening, and see you next time in the Healing Grove.